I think that should be working. Yeah. Okay, so on behalf of the National University of Management and NUM's Social Innovation Lab, I'm very pleased to welcome David Bland to our guest speaker series today. David is the founder and CEO of Precoil, an innovation agency in the San Francisco Bay Area, which was established to help companies find product market fit using lean startup design thinking and business model innovation. He has helped validate new products and services at companies such as GE, Toyota, Adobe, and HP, to name a few. Prior to advising, David spent 10 years of his career at technology startups and continues to give back to the startup community by teaching at several accelerators in Silicon Valley. David is also the co-author of Testing Business Ideas with Alexander Osterwalder, an internationally recognized business book published in November 2019 and translated into several international languages. I first met David in Utah in May 2019 when he was a judge at the International Business Model Competition. And again, in our audience today, we have students from Myanmar, from Bhutan, from Cambodia, and we very much encourage you to sign up for our regional Mekong Challenge National Business Model Competition Cambodia. And hopefully some of the teams here will get to meet David, hopefully at the international finals next year in May in Utah. So I'm therefore very pleased to have David deliver his workshop presentation on testing business ideas to our online audience this morning. Thank you, David.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Seems like ages ago it was in Utah. I'm going to paste a link here in chat, and that's the link where I'm going to be giving the talk. I'll paste it in later when we do the exercise, but if you're just curious of what I'm using to give the talk, you don't have to sign up or pay. You can just join as a visitor. It's a product called Mural, M-U-R-A-L, that I use. So what I'm going to do is just kind of share my screen and go through some of this with you all, and then we'll do a lightweight exercise at the end and do some Q&A. So basically, again, my background is mostly startups. When I left school, I went to school for design. I joined a startup, and we thought we were a financial services startup, and we thought we were business to consumer, and we ended up being a business to business company. And it was that moment where we were almost out of money and we panicked. We didn't really call it a pivot. And we decided to sell to financial advisors at investment banks instead of trying to sell to consumers. And that's when we took off. And I was at a startup for almost 8 years, and I learned a lot the hard way, making lots of mistakes. And we were acquired in 2006 for $16 million US. And then I joined a couple other startups where it didn't go so well. We just kept going forward. We kept persevering. We thought, the customers will just want our stuff if we just build more and more and more. And unfortunately, that didn't work out. It doesn't. So 1 for 3 is probably pretty good in startup land, right? Usually 9 out of 10 fail. But I learned a lot at startups. And then basically over the last 10 years, I've been advising startups, but also universities. And I work with, like I've spoken at Berkeley and at Harvard and Yale and other universities. And I'm also basically trying to help startups. So again, helping with the International Business Model Competition. Just always interested. Like startups are very near and dear to my heart, even though a lot of my work is with big companies too now. So today I'm basically just going to give you kind of a rundown of the book. I have a code of conduct here, although I don't feel like we need it. Basically, it's just like be excellent to each other. So it's kind of the Bill and Ted code of conduct here. So when we're doing Q&A, feel free to ask questions. For those of you not familiar with Mural, the app, basically it's just a web-based whiteboard. So if you want to play around with it, feel free to. Basically, you can just double click and create stickies. It's pretty easy to do. And I had some little tips here in the logistics part in number 2, if you're just curious about how to use it. What I also added here is just this little thing for links. So, this one's like a workshop that I had in the past. You can even like go in and kind of like I'm a facilitator, so I can unlock those. But basically, I can post in some links here that we're not, basically, like what always happens to me when I give talks is people come up with a bunch of things and I end up referring to other books and other things. And then people ask me for the links. So, for example, I can just paste in the link to the book here and it'll just kind of like pull it in, right? So I'll just like drop in some things as we see fit. If I refer to something you're not aware of, I can just like drop it in and drop it in here and lock it so you don't like drag it around. The other thing is if you have questions while I'm talking, you can just use this box number 4 to type in your questions. So, if I double click, I can type in how does this work for B2B, which is, a question I always get. You can basically kind of go in and add questions as you see fit, and you can resize the stickies or, however you want. So if you have questions, you can just drop them in here if you want. And then at the end, we can just refer up to here, or you can just ask them at the end. It's whatever you like. So kind of sections 1 through 3 or 4 are for you, just like learning the platform and being able to kind of interact with me a little bit and lightweight through the talk. But for the most part, I'm here to kind of go through kind of the thinking behind the book, what's in the book, how do we test business ideas, where did I get the ideas for, from all this, kind of what's my world like. So I thought I'd just kind of share some of my thinking with you all, and we can kind of take it from there. So basically, myself and my co-author, Alex Osterwalder, who created the business model canvas, we saw a gap sort of all the teams we worked with. So, every time I work with a team, they would sketch out something like this, which is a business model canvas, and then they'd have a really hard time designing experiments. So if you think of, business model generation, which the book it's amazing. It's about 10 years old now, I think. It was 10 years old this year, I believe. And it's everywhere. A lot of you probably have already experienced like filling out some sort of canvas. And Lean Startup, which is also about 10 years old, I believe, yeah, last year, I think, because I went to the conference in San Francisco with Eric Ries in like November of 2019. And I believe it was 10 years then. So it's been around for about 10 years too. But overall, like we're still pretty much early adopters. like these concepts are not necessarily really widespread yet. And so people still struggle with them. And so what we've been doing is trying to help people make it more actionable. And so with the business model canvas, we've been adding these kind of themes in. So we've been adding these themes in as desirability. So do people want this kind of question? Viability, which is kind of the should we work on this question, and then feasible, which is more of the can we do this. And so when I'm filling out something like this with a business model, when I'm working with a startup or I'm working with entrepreneurs, I tend to start kind of in the middle and I say, okay, what's the value proposition? What's the output? Like, what's the outcome of the product? What is the benefit that your customers get? So I tend to try not just to put a bunch of products in the middle of the canvas. I try to talk about, okay, what do they get from using the product? And then I kind of jump over here to customer. And I say, okay, who is our customer? All right. And so I don't put, 10 different segments in here. I might put 2 or 3 at most. But I basically try to get, entrepreneurs to say, okay, who are the customers we would start with? What's our value prop to them? All right. And then channels, I usually go there because it's all about how do you deliver your value to them, but also how do you reach them? So I think people get confused by channels sometimes. And I've had the pleasure of working with Alex, who created the tool. So I have at least some clarification because I picked up a lot of bad habits, first using the tool on my own, which is, what are your acquisition channels? What are your distribution channels? How do you reach your customer? How do you deliver your value? And then what kind of relationships do you have? Is it transactional? Is it more of like a subscription, ongoing relationship? Like, what's the nature of your relationship with your customer? And then how do you make money? Like, what are your revenue streams? So if you notice, the way I tend to start with something like this is when I'm advising teams, I talk about, okay, what are the things over here on this side, the kind of the front end. And then on the back end, I talk about, okay, so what are the activities do we need to be doing? So think about the verbs. What are the key things you need to do? And then resources, what are the nouns that you need? So what are the physical or digital resources you need to make this work? What's it cost? So what are the costs incurred to make this work? And then who do you partner with? Okay. So if you notice, I don't go left to right. I tend to start with kind of a lot of the desirability part, right? So how do you deliver your value to your customer and how do you reach them? How do you build a relationship with them and what's the nature of the relationship? A lot of that is just desirability risk. So do they understand your value proposition? Do they have a need that you're meeting, an unmet need or a job to be done? Are you able to reach them? Like, a lot of that's desirability. And then I tend to say, okay, well, how do we generate revenue from them, which is more viability? So viability being, should we be doing this, right? So do you generate more revenue than your cost? Okay, on the left side. And then when I think of cost, I think, okay, so the key activities and resources, what are the costs incurred? So you can say, okay, here are all the things we need to be doing, here are all the verbs, and then here are the nouns that we need. So the digital, so patents perhaps, or hardware or software, your team, like all that adds up in cost. But you can say, okay, what are the key things we need to be doing, the activities, what are the key resources we need, and then so what does that end up being as a cost point of view? And then when I talk about partners, it's usually around, okay, so these partners bring key activities or key resources that we don't have. So especially for an entrepreneur, resources are usually really tough to come by. So can we partner with somebody that brings a key activity or key resource that we need to create our value prop? There are some rare occasions too where that key partner may create a channel for you. So for example, you might partner with a retailer or an influencer or something, to basically open up a channel to get to your customers. But, be really thoughtful about how you think about your partners. And so if you start thinking about this, again, a lot of your risk around here, desirability, is about the value proposition, about your customer, about your channels and your relationships. A lot of your risk around viability down here is around your cost and your revenue. And then a lot of your risk around feasibility is here, which is more the can we question. Can you kind of perform the right activities? Can you acquire the right resources? And can you form the right partnerships? And it's not just technical feasibility. I'm sure we have some entrepreneurs here on the session today where you're working with highly regulated industries, for example, if you're working with the government or if you're working with hospitals or working with finance or banks. There are things you can do technically that can work from a technical point of view, but then they violate regulations or they're never going to get approved. So that's still a big risk on a can we kind of question. And so if I zoom out a little bit here, basically you can almost kind of cut the canvas in half, right? And all of this over here is more of the front stage. So this is all like what your customer sees. Okay, I'll zoom out a little bit more for you. Is front stage. And then over here is more of, the backstage. And this is all your operations and things you need to make it work. All right. So your risk kind of moves around, what I've noticed. And so your risk might start on the front stage where your customer doesn't understand your value proposition or they don't have this problem. If you figure this out and find a customer that has the problem, you have a good fit, then sometimes it moves backstage. And you're like, oh, I don't know if we can actually get the resources we need to make this work. I was doing a workshop with, there's about 20 different blockchain startups in Silicon Valley. And they couldn't get any data scientists to work with them. And I was like, you're going to have some serious backstage risk, right? If you're doing blockchain and you can't get the right people to help you kind of build, if you're not expert in it. So it's just something to think about, kind of really unpacking, your strategy So first it's visualizing it, and then it's unpacking it, and then it's understanding, okay, what's the thing I should focus on today? So much of entrepreneurship and innovation is focus, and not everything's the riskiest thing. So how do you focus on, the thing that could kill the whole thing, kill the whole initiative? So basically what we've done, and what I do with teams when I'm working with teams, is we sort of look at it this way. I'll make this a little bigger. We kind of look at it this way, where we say, well, if we write down our assumptions explicitly, so if we state them, right? So, sorry a second. So over here, what I do with the business model canvas, kind of over here, is I will write down, what are all the different assumptions we're making, okay? And there's a ton. Like, it's not just fact because you wrote it down on a canvas. There are quite a few assumptions that you're making, okay? And so I usually use kind of like the "we believe that." So we believe that ... Okay. And I have teams just write these down. Like, what are the ones you have around your value proposition, or your customer, or your ability to reach them, or your revenue, or your cost, or your activities and resources? Like, what are all these things that we don't know are true, and then bring them over. And I just have this little 2x2 exercise I do with startups, and it's pretty simple. I basically have, it's called assumptions mapping, and we do important and unimportant, and then have evidence and no evidence. So what I'm really curious is, like, what are the things that are so important, like if proven wrong, we fail in a big way? And do we have evidence to support these statements? Like these like, we believe that statements, all right? And so I like colors. So as you can probably tell, I use orange for desirability, and then green for viability, and blue for feasibility. And what I'm really interested in is up here. Like, what are the things that are the most important where you have no evidence to support it? And so I made this. So I first learned a similar exercise working with Jeff Gothelf and Josh Seiden, who wrote Lean UX and Sense of Respond. And Jeff has a new book called Forever Employable. I work with them at my past job. And I just kept iterating on the exercise because teams were close. They were trying to map things in a 2x2, and everybody, like, there are all kinds of different 2x2s out there, but they couldn't actually narrow in on what the most important thing was. And so I used to say, is it known or unknown? And it didn't work. And then I would say, is it certain or uncertain? And it still didn't work. And then Alex Osterwalder and myself, we said, okay, let's use have evidence and no evidence. So if you have evidence, great, it's more of a statement. If you don't have evidence, then like it's just, you're just making it up. Like, you don't know if it's a fact or not. And so basically what we did is we worked on this exercise to get teams to kind of basically talk about where to focus, okay? And then from there, we would design experiments that would basically help the risk, So for example, I'm trying to think how to frame this. There are 44 different experiments that that we have that match your risk back to, like, the experiment back to the kind of risk you have. Okay, so one of the ways to think about this is down here. So for example, with regards to the kind of taxonomy that we have, what we did is we, I want to apologize, we got some like scribbles. Let me get rid of them. Nope, I can't. So I don't know what happened over there. So anyway, apologies for the scribbles. I think there's a bug or something here. So basically with cost, we said, okay, how expensive are some of these experiments? And then setup time and run time. So basically, like, how long does it take to set up the experiment, and how long does it take to run? And then what kind of evidence does it create? Is it weak or strong? And so, being, in the Bay Area for quite some time and all that, people would always quote Steve Jobs, right? They would say, well, Steve said never talk to customers, and that's not exactly like what he said. um, but there's a lot of that, right? It's well, don't bother talking to customers; they don't know what they want. And actually, customers can be very helpful in you understanding, the words of the customer, their needs. It doesn't don't expect them to tell you how to build or how to solve everything, but it's still great directional evidence, right? It's low strength of evidence because it's what they say, not what they do, but it's still really valuable to go through and do some of those. And so it's just really interesting to see kind of like, you know, people maybe kind of skip that part, but I still like interviews. But then something stronger could be, you actually built a minimum viable product where it's something there's an interaction and you're delivering value in some way. And so that can actually be a strong strength of evidence because people might be paying for it, or you might actually be delivering some kind of product or solution to them. And so what we ended up doing was, so basically in the book, we essentially kind of zoomed in and said, okay, what are the discovery experiments? So what are the experiments where they're open-ended directional kind of experiments? And so we framed this off of Steve Blank's 4 Steps to the Epiphany, or drawing inspiration from there anyway. Steve heavily influenced Eric Ries's work, who wrote Lean Startup. And I've also had the pleasure of working with Eric Ries in the past. And the framing here was customer discovery and customer validation. But for us, what we've done is said, okay, what if we have basically beyond the customer? What if we went to overall discovery and overall validation, not just discovery, but like on the customer, but also with viability and feasibility, and just go broader. And so in the book, and I can't go into all these today, but we have all these experiments categorized, and we said, okay, beyond interviews, what can you do? Well, you can do like storyboards and speedboat exercises and feature stubs and ads and day in the life. And there's all these like great things that are already out there that people are doing. And so what we are trying to provide here is like an encyclopedia for you, or a library where you can just go and reference, which one should you run based on where you are in your journey. If you've already performed 15 to 20 interviews with your customer, what's the next thing you can do instead of building the whole product, which I've seen a bunch of founders do. They'll talk to 15 or 20 people, and then they'll go spend $600,000 on an app and not know if anybody wants it really, and that's a really big bet instead of placing smaller bets. We also have validation experiments, which again, they kind of come in and are delivering more value, I would say, because they're further along down the path, and you're basically experimenting in a way that delivers value. There are a couple here I kind of wanted to point out. One being, how to run like MVPs. I think we always turn that term like minimum viable product. Like one is a concierge. So if you manually deliver the whole service like by hand, then that's a kind of validation experiment you can run where you just manually do it all. Sometimes I'm working with teams and they don't build any software. They just manually create the images, or manually create the dashboard, or whatever it is that the customer is looking for, and they don't actually build anything at all. And it's very much like a hand delivered service, which is why it's called concierge. The kind of similar one to that would be something like Wizard of Oz, which Wizard of Oz is kind of like concierge, but it's not obvious a person is involved. So you have like something behind the scenes, like people doing the work, but the customer doesn't really see them, so they're not sure it's actually they think it might be software or an algorithm or something. I laugh that, I meet all these AI startups, and behind the scenes, it's like a lot of people like manually doing stuff. So, a lot of those aren't necessarily algorithms yet or AI yet. Sometimes it's just people doing things. And then a single feature MVP, which is more of, basically early days Foursquare would be a good example, or Hotel Tonight, where you just click and it does one thing and just one thing really well. And then a mashup MVP, which is more like the no code movement. So if you have like an unbounced page wired to Airtable, wired to like some kind of Google form, and you're just, think of early days, maybe Groupon or something like that, where it was just a WordPress blog and a bunch of PDF, coupons and stuff like that. You can do a lot without coding at all and just wiring together different services. I see that happen quite a lot. And you can still deliver a lot of value that way. But basically, what we tried to do is say, okay, how would people go about and sort of, start to select and choose and go through some of these. So one of the ones I wanted to kind of talk through, which I thought was really interesting with the team I was working with, was treating like online ads like experiments. And so I was working with a team that was doing something for mouth pain. And we were trying to figure out, how do we reach people with mouth pain? How do we acquire them? How do we bring them into a landing page to talk to us or sign up for a beta product that we had that would address mouth pain? And it was really interesting experience, because, the cost, it wasn't very high. Depending on where you run your ads, we were running Facebook and Twitter ads at first. The setup time and runtime aren't very long. You can drive hundreds of people every day, to a page. And the evidence strength is, it's not bad. It's kind of in the middle, because if they're willing to give up, if they're willing to click on something in the wild, they don't know it's an experiment, versus like inviting someone into your lab or a focus group, right? It's more out there in the real world. And so what we ended up doing is we tried this kind of push approach, where we were like, okay, we're going to push ads about mouth pain to Facebook and to Twitter, and we're going to get people to come over to our landing page and basically sign up, right, for the trial. And we only had about a 1% conversion. It was not good. The team was really almost ready to give up. And what was going on is we were trying to find people who had the problem and they were aware of it. But we kind of stopped there, right? So we were just trying to push our solution to them. And not surprisingly, no one clicked almost. And the people that did click just didn't convert at all. And so the team was really depressed and they were about ready to give up. And we said, look, before we give up, let's try something else. Let's try a pull where we basically did Google ads, but we did Google search only. Okay, so basically the way that works is when someone types into Google. So we did some search trend analysis and we realized there were a lot of people searching for the problem we were trying to solve about mouth pain. And so what we ended up doing was serving up the same ad, but doing it in the results when they were searching. So what was happening is we ended up here, where they're actively seeking a solution to a problem. And same ad, same landing page, right? We had a 40% conversion, right? So we went from 1% to 40, which is an outlier. I'm happy if teams get 10 or 15% usually as a call to action, and then conversion on a call to action on a page that describes the problem. But we were kind of using this method. And again, I learned this from Steve Blank, but do they have the problem? Are they aware? And are they actively seeking a solution to that problem? And depending on where they are in that journey, you have to kind of design your experiments and your acquisition tests to find them where they are. And so that was a really big learning for me, where this team almost gave up. And using almost the same copy and everything, we went from 1% to 40% just by finding people when they were searching. Okay. And you probably shouldn't go to Google and type in, a bunch of medical problems. It's not the greatest place to go do that, but people do it. So yeah, so that it was where they're searching, right? And so again, just like an example of how to kind of think through and treat it like treat them like experiments and not just things you go off and execute. The other one I want to talk about, well, another style that I use quite a bit is like a concierge, and I also use Wizard of Oz, which is, it takes, it's not very expensive, doesn't take long to set up and run, but the evidence strength is quite stronger because, in these kinds of experiments, people are interacting and getting value back. Okay. And so with this one, concierge and also Wizard of Oz, there's some really funny examples that I've worked on over the years. Some of the products I helped test with Adobe were started off as concierge, where someone would go to a landing page and they would type in the kind of image they want, and a designer would literally hand create it to them. So basically it created a Trello card, and we hand delivered, basically emailed it back to the person and said, is this what you needed? That became a really successful Adobe product, a mobile product later on. But in the beginning, we just manually designed things. Adobe Spark ended up being that way. Adobe Voice, which is also how to create explainer videos, started that way, where the product manager literally just created the videos by hand in Adobe Premiere and handed them back to the customer that requested them and said, is this what you're looking for? Would you post this on your site? Would you post this on YouTube for your explainer video? And if they're not willing to post it, you kind of know that what you're creating is not sort of what they expect. And so a lot of trial and error through hand holding your way through that can result in how you inform your product and how you actually design your product later on. Because all of those we ended up kind of shutting down, but we rebuilt them, with Adobe branding and everything, and built them the right way, but with evidence. Like, it wasn't just people sitting in a room going, wouldn't it be cool if like you built this or you built this, and then building it, right? It was based on evidence, based on customer feedback, and we use that to kind of build our products. So there are a lot of really interesting ways you can use this, and probably the hardest thing here is just like resisting the urge to build. It's like, it doesn't scale, it's okay, but you can learn a lot by hand delivering things or by manually creating value. And I feel like the pushback there is like, well, but it's not as fun as building, and we'd almost rather build something and scale it and then find out people don't care than actually like take the time and do something that doesn't scale. But I really love this one too. This is one that I almost always recommend with the teams I work with. I don't want to spend the whole time talking. Well, it's my evening, but your morning. What I wanted you to do is maybe just a lightweight exercise, if you would entertain me here. So I'm going to put the link back in. I can find my chat window. I'm going to put the link back in here. So for those of you that aren't in, you can just click that link. And what I've done is I've actually kind of taken a bunch of stuff from the book. So all these experiments, if you zoom in, these are all from the book. And I've pasted them in here in the board for you. And so, again, we can't cover all, in such a short session. But with discovery, you could start looking through and say, okay, well, what are the kind of things and what kind of experiments do they like, what kind of setup and runtime do they have? What kind of themes do they test? Is it desirability only, or is it desirability and viability, or desirability, viability, and feasibility, right? And what you can do is, if you're curious about one of these, let's say you're not sure with like what a feature stub is, you can double click on it and it will bring it up for you. And then you could zoom in and basically see what it is. So you can double click on these and they'll zoom in for you. But basically what I wanted you to do was think through something that you're working on or you'd like to work on, and think about what a sequence of experiments you could create that would help you know if you're on the right track. So let's just say, for example, I'll start off here. Let's just say I was building. Okay. One of the things we tested in New York, which was pretty fun. The New York team at my last company tested a dating app for men that was SMS based. Okay, so it was an SMS based dating. Um, it was a bot really, um, dating chatbot for men. All right, so that's what we tested. All right. So the sequence we used is we did some customer interviews to see if men had any challenges with dating, and of course they did, or at least men in New York did. Um, we did a landing page that had a call to action. Um, we also had we had a discussion forum that we had discussion forum posts. So like on Hacker News, it was pasted there. And then we had a well, actually, it was like Wizard of Oz. We had a Wizard of Oz experiment where a team of women, okay, would answer the requests. So basically, use Twilio, which is just like this basically service-based app API. We we had people, men, sending in requests to a bot. But it wasn't a bot. It was a group of women responding as if they were a bot. Okay, and then we tried to find out, would men actually text a bot to learn about dating advice? So we kind of went from interviews to a landing page to a discussion forum to get people to come to the page, and then when they actually sent the SMS, it just ended up going to this group of women who actually responded. We learned a lot of things in that sequence. One was that men were willing to do that. We had 1,000 signups at the first day. We had to shut down the signup page because it overwhelmed the women, and then they couldn't respond to the men, and then the men were very depressed that the bot wasn't answering their dating questions. So like that didn't end well. I think in hindsight we would have had maybe sign up for a wait list or something like that, but we all learn things the hard way. But as far as a sequence of experiments to run to say, hey, are we on to something where are we going to build something that actually be successful? This was kind of similar to the sequence, right? So think of a series of experiments. You could go from one, take what you've learned, and use that to inform the next thing, and use that to inform the next thing. And so basically what I wanted to give you space to do today is I'm going to give you 5 minutes. So basically, if you have an idea that you're working on, you can go down here below and just double click, and you can start kind of creating your sequence of what you think could help you with what you're working on, or some early stage idea that you have. Okay. So you can use these up here for inspiration, for discovery and validation. You don't have to. You can actually type if you have others that you want to include. That's fine too. But I'm going to set a timer up here. So I'm going to give you 5 minutes, let you all kind of double click in here and click around a little bit. And then if one of you want to share something you come up with, I just want you to get practice of what this could be like. And then we can also do some Q&A before we wrap up. All right. So 5 minutes. Scan through, some of these experiments, and if there's something you're working on that you want to list down here, you can just double click and add them in. All right. All right. So 5 minutes and go. I pasted the URL into the board again because I accidentally pasted the other link earlier. So the link I just pasted is the one if you want to jump in. We have about 2 minutes left. All right, about 10 more seconds. I love that the chime sounds like a seatbelt sign airport. I have like flashbacks to
Looks like a lot
pre-pandemic.
of activity based on all the interaction going on here on the screen. So I'm curious to see the.
Yeah, I'll do one more while you all are still playing with this. So I went to a talk before the pandemic hit. I went to a talk in Silicon Valley with one of the founders of Tesla before even Elon Musk was involved. And so I'll just say Tesla mule. So back before Tesla became like, this super popular, like world renowned company, they were just trying to figure out how to create their first car, you know? And so when I went to the talk, which was really great, it's on YouTube as well. I learned that before they even basically created the first Tesla, they did what I would call a boomerang test. And so what they ended up doing is there were almost no electric vehicles registered in the state of California in like 2006 or so, between like 2003 to 2006. And they're like, why is that? And they basically went out and did research on all the electric vehicles, and they found out they were all ugly. They all looked like appliances. They didn't look like cars, and nobody liked them. So except like maybe with the exception of like the Honda, there was just nothing out there that people actually enjoyed. The next thing they did was what I would call actually a mashup. They basically went to the Lotus Elise. So basically, they went to Lotus and they said, we want a small batch, chassis here. Lotus had already collaborated with other car manufacturers in the past. So they basically took an existing Lotus chassis. Even if you go and you look online at the first Tesla, you'll notice it has like the T on the front, but on the back it says Lotus. So they very much like just cobbled together a car based on components they made and bought, but also just with the existing body from Lotus. And then they did a landing page with a call to action, which was, hey, we're working on this amazing electric car that's going to be like a sports car. Here's what it's about. And they had, some pictures to show because they were already working on this. They're basically bootstrapping at that point They raised a little bit of money, but they were making their own, car company. And they did a pre-order. So I don't know if you remember, but the early pre-orders, you had to pay $100,000 US dollars in upfront that would secure a pre-order for a Tesla. And they sold 100 of those. Do the math. They did 100,000 US dollar orders on a Tesla, and they were actually behind delivering them. But if you look at kind of what they did, they started off with, let's do some basically some competitive testing to see why people aren't signing up for electric vehicles. It was mostly because they were slow and they looked clunky and they weren't fun to drive. They actually built one using a Lotus Elise and other parts. They launched their landing page, and then they had pre-orders, and and then they kept going from there. But it was really interesting to go to that talk and hear them how they iterated through basically designing a car. And there are all kinds of challenges there. I mean, like, the car is one of the most, like, especially electric car, it's one of the most advanced things you could possibly build. And so there's so much complexity there. So there's all kinds of really interesting examples of this. And so as you get more familiar with these experiments, I think you'll start to see how to like piece them together over time and then realize if you're on the right track or not. Okay. Okay. So with that, I'd love to open it up to questions. It looks like we have a few up here. I'll just try to run through these until we have time. So we have about 13 minutes left. All right. So the first question here is, in Business Canvas, why does it have to follow a certain order? Is it possible to start with the box that we feel most comfortable with? You don't always have to follow this order. So I'll scroll back down here. This is the order I use like 90% of the time, though. I would say I have worked with companies that start with like number 7. And the reason they start with number 7 is because they have some sort of technology that they're trying to figure out how to create a value prop from it and how to make money with it with a customer in a market. Okay. And so there are companies I work with that start with number 7 first. There are companies I start with that start with number 2 first. But that's about it. It's really, really hard to start on any of these other ones because you really need to know what your value proposition is and who your customer is and how you're going to make money and then how you're going to make it all happen. So, when I I gave this talk actually in 2019 at the International Business Model Competition in Utah. And I had one of the attendees raise their hand and say, we've validated viability. And that was it. And I'm like, okay, how did you validate viability, which is cost and revenue, without ever talking to your customers, without ever like figuring out how to build the thing? Like, it's hard to really validate one of these in isolation. Okay, so they're all related. You can start with the one you're most comfortable with, but the real big point here I'm trying to make is that it's all connected and it's all a story. So even if you start with one that you feel comfortable with, make sure that you're going through the whole thing because it's a coherent story. When I just did this with like 70 some entrepreneurs this morning in Silicon Valley, and we had them all practice sharing out what they created. Okay. And so when their story doesn't make sense, it's usually because they have a problem with their strategy. All right. They included revenue streams that don't have a source, or they have a value prop that's not connected to a customer. So just whatever you do, make sure that when you're going through it, you see the relationships between all the different boxes and that you are trying to tell a coherent, clear story. I had one entrepreneur last year approach me after the workshop and said, this is the first time anyone's understood my startup. And he's been working on it for like 2 or 3 years. So it can be a really powerful storytelling tool. The flow that I laid out for you and the numbers here is the one I use most of the time. You don't have to use it, but it's the one I use most of the time because it works. And a lot of your risk usually is up front with the customer and your value prop. Okay, but it's a good question. What else? At which stage of startup that most applies Business Model Canvas? Any suggestions on how to revise it as the startup evolves? So I tend to sketch these out pretty early. Now, I know we've kind of had a bad habit, especially out here in Silicon Valley, where we say, just figure out the business model later. And there are some problems with that approach. One, it's really hard to rely on VC money over and over and over again, and it doesn't always work out. We're seeing a lot of public companies. We're seeing companies like Uber and Lyft and DoorDash losing tons of money every year. And the state of California recently said, you have to treat your contractors as employees, your independent contractors. And so they built this entire kind of empire off of the gig economy, right? Not paying them as much, not giving them benefits, not treating them as employees, and they still lose hundreds of millions of dollars. And so I just don't feel like it's a sustainable thing right now. So I'm really worried about some of these companies that they're just not going to be able to sustain, especially if they have to treat their contractors as real employees. So I would, even when I'm at Singularity University and I'm at other accelerators, I tend to say, do this early on. At least take your best guess of what it could be, and then go test and update it. You're probably not making big changes into it, at least like once a month at most, because you're not going to change your entire business model every week or every day. But you should be going off and testing it and seeing if you're on the right track. So usually I spend about 12 weeks with a team to know if you ran an experiment a week for 12 weeks, you should have enough evidence to know, are you on the right track at all, or should you pivot, persevere, or kill what you're working on? It's not a perfect number, but I don't want you to get too excited after the first experiment. And I don't want you to get too depressed after the first experiment. It usually takes a while to know whether or not you're on the right track. If you're building a marketplace, it usually takes about a year. From everybody I've spoken to and met with that's built marketplaces, because you have supply and demand side, it takes a long time to figure that out and dial it in. So I think sometimes just don't get too frustrated that it's not happening quickly enough. Like, I don't know, I was at my first startup 8 years almost. So it's quite a long-term investment. And so don't get too excited or too depressed after your first experiments. How to avoid bias opinion when testing the idea. Biases are just there with us. They're not necessarily bad, right? So they've kept us alive, so that's good. But they can work against us, and there are kind of three major ones that I see, and that I actually did a webinar on. I don't remember; it was like last year, I think. But basically, confirmation bias, which is more of like you're just kind of confirming what you already believe, and you're just trying to like only experiment and confirm what you believe. There's experimenter's bias, where you sort of like explain away or manipulate the data. There are others, but basically be thinking about, the way I tend to address these is I say, don't do it by yourself, include other people, because those biases tend to creep in. And if there's no one there to challenge you, you end up basically, you could run down the wrong path by just believing your own hype, right? So like overconfidence bias. Overconfidence bias is one I see a lot, which is like you're just really overconfident about your direction, and you're not even sure you need to test anything, so you skip things. And so really think about this as like scientific method applied to business. And so you need to question your assumptions. You need to be open to the idea that you might be wrong. And it's one of the reasons, I mean, it might sound kind of silly, but when I said down here that I write these as we believe that, I do that for a reason, because I want you to be open to the fact that these are beliefs and that you could be wrong, and you're open to the idea of testing them. And so, again, it's not for every entrepreneur to work this way. Not everyone buys into this, but I've seen enough failed startups and personally spent weekends and nights building stuff nobody cared about. So I guess maybe I'm biased that way, but I like thinking that I have these beliefs, and do I have any evidence to support this belief? And if I don't, then I'd be willing to kind of try other things. So just try to include other people when possible. I feel like that's usually the biggest challenge that teams have. It's just, if you're doing this by yourself, it's just too easy for these biases to creep in. nobody challenges you on them, and then you move down a path. And I feel like just even having other people included, if it's a coach or an advisor or a co-founder, parts of your team, just get feedback on what you're working on, so that it's not just you. Because I feel like when you're alone, that's usually when the biases creep in the most, and there's no one there to check them. And you want to succeed, so it's really easy to try to make things look like successes when they're not. Two more. So in making a product, should revenue be considered on expected cost that will be incurred, or should costs come out of focusing on expected revenue? That seems pretty situational. I'm not sure how to address that one. So much in making a product is it really just comes back to the cost incurred to create. So for example, you might do some kind of minimum viable product and bootstrap from there. But if you're working, in a heavily regulated like medical industry, your costs are going to be much bigger. So one of my favorite examples actually came out of business model competition in BYU is Owlet. They have a sock, infant sock, that's pulse oximetry, and they won the competition. It wasn't one I joined it. It was one before, I think the year before I started helping out. And they had a sock which would had pulse oximetry. So for infants, when their oxygen levels would drop, which is kind of sudden infant death syndrome, which is a huge problem with infants, where they fall asleep and they roll over a certain way and they can't breathe. It would actually perform an alarm on your phone. What they realized was that for the alarm, they needed to get FDA approval, Food and Drug Administration approval, which was hundreds of thousands of dollars, to basically have a sock and an app with an alarm with pulse oximetry. They didn't have that kind of money. It was just like, two guys. And what they realized when they were testing with customers was that there was a whole group of parents who didn't want the alarm. They said, no, I don't want that alarm. I just want to know, like, what's the data. I'm going to keep an eye on my kid anyway. I have baby monitors, have other things. I just want to know some of the data that this throws off on the app, because I think it would help me. And so if they hadn't actually performed that customer discovery and research, they would have never understood that there was a whole segment that didn't need an alarm. Okay. And so what they ended up doing was building a version of this without the alarm, sold it, right, and raised the money they needed to go through the FDA approval process and kind of build the one with the alarm. So, just be mindful of the costs incurred. And what I try to do is keep costs low as much as possible and try to defer building as much as possible, because costs can add up really quickly. And before you know it, you're hundreds of thousands in debt and you have an app that nobody wants, and you can't pivot if you're broke. You can't, there's no pivoting. You need money to pivot. So I tend to keep costs really low as far as I can. So I hope I answered your question. I'm not sure I did, but hopefully that helped. And we have one more: how to develop the criteria to evaluate the result from validation. What are the key considerations? Yeah, so that's when you come back to the synthesizing your results, it's hard. Sometimes you need a data scientist to help out. If it's interviews, I typically do something like affinity sorting, where I group things into clusters to see if there are any themes coming out. But it's the hard part of experimentation, where you need to sit down and go through the data. Otherwise, you kind of don't see the benefit of doing it, right? So if you ran a bunch of experiments, but you didn't actually gain insights from them, you're probably just going to go build what you wanted to anyway. And so having this space and help to kind of go through, and each one's different. You have to look for conversion metrics on pages and ads, industry specific. If you're looking for people ranking jobs, pains, and gains, if they have to be 80% accurate, you have to go through and actually do the statistical analysis of how people rank things. So it does take time. I would recommend, obviously the book has some tips, but also don't be afraid to reach out to other people like data scientists or people to help you. But if you don't do that hard work and get the insights, then you'll probably just skip over and build, what you want to anyway. All right. I think those are all the questions, and we're up on time. So anyway, it was a lot to cover in an hour, but I appreciate your attention. And Anything else you want to say, Stephen, before I let
Just
everybody?
maybe just one very fast question. How much of this, in terms of your consulting side of the business, are existing companies like corporations who are launching new products and new services who want to use this methodology? So I assume it's not just obviously for startups, right? A lot of corporations are also now using this type of methodology to test new products, new services.
Yeah. So I would say from overall, I mean, not looking at my pipeline at the moment, but about 80% of my work right now is from corporations trying to build new things. And so what has happened is the founders are gone or they've transitioned off onto something else, part of the business, and they're not really sure how to test their way through creating a new product or business. And they're not really sure how to make it a repeatable process. So it's a large portion of my work right now. And the way I stay sane is it's very similar to how I would approach it at a startup. It's just the context is different. You know, I can't do anything that would damage their brand or, you know, do anything of that nature. But it's a lot of my work over the last several years. So like Adobe and GE and Toyota, and there's countless other corporations around the world that I've worked with in different industries. They're all struggling with the same thing, which is we have a lot of risk in building something new. We're not sure how to do it and pay down our risk, and we're not sure how to make it a repeatable process. Because I had a executive a couple weeks ago say to me, "We want to test 1,000 ideas over the next 5 years, and 95 or 99% of them will fail." To do that, if you want to get through 1,000 ideas, you need a repeatable process to do that over years. And most companies are they're really not sure. A lot of them never worked this way before. So
This is good because we have a lot of our MBA students here also joining the session who are working for larger companies and corporations in Phnom Penh. So I just want them to realize that this is not just for startups, that they can go back to their organizations and also introduce this type of methodology. So I think it's always good to point out, because sometimes people just think it's only for startups, but the whole intrapreneurship, sort of thinking entrepreneurially within large organizations, this type of methodology is also quite useful.
yeah, early on in the book, there's a spread where we write like who the book's for, and it's for one, corporate innovators, so pretty much the entrepreneur. It's for entrepreneurs, so more like startup entrepreneurs. And it's also for what we call a solopreneur, which is somebody that has something on the side. They're doing nights and weekends, and they're not sure whether to make the jump and do it full time. So we tested it rigorously, as you would. A book on testing, we had to test the book. And it certainly does apply to big companies. Again, the constraints are a little different. You can't go out there and launch something that's going to hurt your brand. And you can't break, regulations and things like that, of course. But I would say it's about 80% of my work right now is helping big companies.
Okay, well, thank you very much for this session, because I'm mindful of the time. I think we're slightly over the time. And again, we will share the video with our teams that are applying for this year's competition. And we will also encourage our master's students in global innovation management to use the book in their courses. So we'll also help promote the book and the online materials. And I very much hope to see you in May next year in Utah at the International Business Model Competition with some of our top teams here, hopefully some of the ones who actually attended your workshop. So very much appreciate your time for spending it with our group this evening.
Yeah, I'm a judge at that competition, so you're getting a behind the scenes view of how I look at things from a judge perspective. So if anything else, hopefully this helps you, be better prepared for the competition. So it was awesome. I'm just happy to help out.
Okay, thank you very much.
All right. Thanks, everyone.